A composting toilet is a really great thing to have. It saves a lot of water compared to a flush toilet. It retains that fertility on site and ultimately gives you good compost that you can use around fruit bushes and trees and such. Potentially also there's a lot of liquid fertility as well, and it also gives you a great sense of satisfaction in my experience. So here's 5 things to think about to make sure that your composting toilet is as good as it can be. So the first thing to consider is location. Where are you going to put your composting toilet? And to some degree this depends on the kind of loo you might use, but that also in turn might depend on where you can put it. And I would say one of the most important things is where you locate your toilet. So firstly, it needs to be close enough to your main building where you spend a lot of time for you to be using it, because it's very easy to go to the closest place, particularly if you're needing to go to the toilet urgently. It's very easy to go, I'll just use the normal loo just the once today, and of course that becomes a habit. And so a compost toilet that's too far away is not going to get used, and so there's no point in creating it in the first place. At the same time, you also don't want a composting toilet too close. Yeah, I remember using one once that was right next door to the kitchen, and I got diarrhea and I would be not surprised to learn that somehow those two things, there was contamination, got into the kitchen and so on. So find that fine balance. Another thing to be thinking about is desire lines. You know, where do you move through the site? So maybe if you put your compost toilet where you already tend to go, or the opposite side of that might be to put it somewhere that you don't go very often, so that you do go to that place and you start to open up that place as somewhere that you do things and you give attention to plants, because where we go, we give attention. And so, for instance, the lettuces here, if there was no reason to come to this corner of the orchard, they wouldn't get much attention. But because they're here and we use the loo every day, then we're giving them attention. This becomes a more useful space. Another thing to think about is shelter. So if you're in a windy site, then you definitely want to create some shelter. And so we've put our loo in this corner because it's the point at which the retaining wall is the highest and the prevailing wind comes over the hill, and it's the most sheltered spot in this part of the garden. And having done looking at locations early on in our site design, this was the only place realistically we could put it where a composting toilet would work. Another thing to think about, of course, is if you're on the low ground and there's a risk of flooding, you also don't want to put your toilet where it might flood for perhaps, I hope, obvious reasons. Now, many of us live in urban areas, have small gardens, and another thing that we in the UK need to be aware of is something called planning regulations, and we have something called permitted development, which allows you to, without applying for planning permission, construct things like sheds, but they have to be below a maximum height, which I think is 2.3 meters, but also the floor can't be more than 30 centimeters or a foot off the ground. So you can't build it high. And also it has to be a certain distance away from neighbours' boundaries. So there are other things that might, to some degree, determine where your location is. So if you can't locate your toilet, then there's no point in going any further. I am, of course, talking about an outside toilet. So it is another system that you might use, is to have an indoor toilet and then to bring out the human manure to be composted out of doors. But that's all to do with types of toilet, and let's move on to that now. So when it comes to deciding what kind of toilet you want, the initial thing to think about is indoors versus outdoors. Do I want an indoor compost toilet? And there are various different versions of this, from the expensive ones, which might cost you £1,000 or more, and they tend to have an electricity supply with a fan, and they dry out the material, make it much easier to work with and to handle. And I suppose there's an element of being more hygienic. And then there's the bucket toilet, which is essentially a bucket in a box with a toilet seat on top, and that gets filled up over the period of a week, and then you would take that outside usually and put it onto a compost heap. But you would use, in that case, because you want to kill the pathogens, you will be using a hot composting system. And so even though that takes up a little bit of space, very little space indoors, you still need quite a lot of space outside. So that isn't necessarily the best option or the most obvious solution to the problem of not having a lot of room in your garden, for instance. And then we've got this idea, well, if we've got an outdoor toilet, then what kind of toilet? Because there are different ways we can approach one main challenge, certainly for us in cool temperate climates like Britain, which is how do we allow the composting human manure to rest for an extra year and ideally 2 winters before we use it. And there's 2 ways of approaching this. One is to have 2 chambers, and that's what we've gone with here. So there's 1 chamber, so 1 room, but 2 chambers beneath the toilet, beneath the floor. And so for 1 year, for a year, we use one side. So the toilet seat is over here, and we fill up the chamber, the tank, which is underneath this side. And we'll lift the floor up shortly and show you what that looks like, at least on the nicely composted side. And then at the end of the year, you swap them over. So we've got 2 boards, plywood boards here, that have the same screw holes. And so all we do is we unscrew this side, we unscrew that side, and we swap them over. So then the toilet seat is over here. This is closed off, and the one that's closed off can't possibly be, nobody can use that because it's completely screwed down. So that's a really nice way of approaching that. But of course you need the space to accommodate the 2 chambers or tanks that you're collecting your human manure in. And so that means generally you need a bigger footprint for your building. So we have a shed here that's about 6 feet, 2 meters by 6 feet, 2 meters. And that's enough for 2 of us. We'll get to capacity in a minute, how big things need to be, but we also need to design for size. Another approach is to have 1 toilet, 1 seat, or you could have, if you needed the capacity, you could have 2 toilets being used all the time, but with a container that you then swap the container out. So often this is, you've probably heard of wheelie bin toilets. Another approach is to use sort of barrels, 30, 50 litre barrels, and they get filled up. Obviously once they're full you need to be able to move them, so a wheelie bin gives you the opportunity to move a heavier bin around and swap them out less often. The problem I have with wheelie bins is that you can't turn them. They're very unwieldy. You whittle them around and they're very difficult to get a fork into and aerate, because of course they're very tall and they have a small space at the top. So for me, wheelie bin toilets, I've rarely seen it done well, but I'm not saying it can't be. The barrel system has the potential to work better, I would say, because you can screw the barrel on, and you usually with the olive barrels you get this sort of clamp so that it's properly sealed, and you can roll them around, so you can aerate them by rolling them around, which you certainly can't do with the wheelie bin. A larger version of this you've probably seen at festivals is the Thunderbox, which is a large 1 cubic meter IBC, which is usually used of water tanks, plastic things in cages. And they're also the guy that we know that does them here in Britain. He takes them back to the farm and he just uses a tractor to turn them over from time to time because they're cubes, and he aerates them that way. We've gone with a different system, which is to have chambers under here, and one of our primary issues is the water table, because we're at the top of a hill, pretty much at the top of a hill, and at the top of the hill you have very little soil usually, because over many years rain has washed it down into the valleys. So if you're in the valleys, you get nice deep soils, but you're prone potentially to flooding, which you've also got to be aware of. And up here we've got about a foot of soil, 30 centimetres of soil at most, less in some places, on top of bedrock. And so for us, that was the main challenge for us, was to get around this issue of we can only go down about a foot before we hit bedrock, but we can only bring the floor of the structure up about a foot because of planning regulations. And so we had this sort of 2-foot space that we had to deal with. And when we worked out the capacity of that, it wasn't quite enough, and we had to dig into that a little bit, which was, because it's a mudstone, that wasn't too difficult, but it was still quite a lot of work. But we went with that because that just felt like the best way to do it for us. We didn't really like the idea of having to store barrels of stuff. And there was a story recently of a couple who disappeared. They'd left the country and left behind, from some kind of eco thing they were doing, about 150 barrels of human manure just sitting there on the site. And that obviously was really bad, really bad publicity for composting toilets. So don't do that, don't do that. So another option that there is here is, rather than putting anything into containers, that we do something called a tree bog, create a tree bog. And a tree bog is that you poop, usually the platform is higher, so that wasn't going to work for us here for planning reasons. But if you can do that, then you maybe have a metre off the ground, about 3 feet off the ground, and you poop down onto soil where the microbes are that are going to eat the poop. And then you plant lots of hungry plants around, usually things like comfrey and willow, around the outside of the structure that eat it all up. So you never have to handle it, you never have to go in. And there are certain things that you do, that you put a bit of wire fencing around and straw, so you get ventilation, but you don't get to look at it, and you keep the animals out and that kind of thing. So that's another option, but it requires, even though you only have one seat and the building could be half the size of this one, the problem then is that the plants you're growing, and they're growing very vigorously because you're feeding them lots, they take up a lot of space. And so we decided, even though the structure would be smaller, it would just take up too much space for us here, because space is limited, and we've got a big garden compared to many people, but we also want to plant lots of trees and food plants and that kind of thing. So we went with this system. And then the next question is, do you want to use a separator or not? So a separator does what nature does, which it keeps the solids and the liquids separate rather than it all going in together. The danger with putting it all in together is that you get anaerobic decomposition. So basically it decomposes without oxygen. If you've got a wheelie bin, for instance, or a tank that's full of urine and human manure, and the whole thing just stinks and it's really horrible. So personally, that's not a system that makes sense to me. So we have a separator, which we use. So you just sit normally on the toilet seat, and the liquids go forwards and the solids go backwards. And that also means you need less capacity for storage, because of course once the liquids are out of the way, then you've only got to store the solids, which gets us on to doing the maths of how big does the capacity need to be. So when it comes to work out the capacity, how big your tank or your chamber needs to be, we can do some simple maths. And the first thing we need to know is how much solids. So you need to accommodate about 200 litres of solids per person per year, assuming you're separating, which we are. And on top of that, you need to add another third again in volume to account for the carbon-rich material which is being put on top. This is called soak, and it's designed to soak up to some degree the liquid in the human manure. So feces is about 90% water when it comes out, so it needs to dry some of that out, but also urine and feces is very high in nitrogen, so we're adding carbon to make a nice balanced compost. And so a lot of what you can see in here in this chamber is, well, carbon rich material, as you can see. So we've got 200 litres per person plus another third again, which is about 70 litres. So we were looking and saying, well, there's 2 of us here, so we want to accommodate 270 litres per person per year, so double that to 540. And then we could say, well, if we've got 13, 14 people coming on a course for 2 weeks, we multiply 2 by 14 or 13, that gets us to about half a person year as well. So if we can accommodate 2.5 people's worth, given that I'm away teaching sometimes, and we're not always using the loo every day anyway, if we're away and such. So I got to about 700 litres and thought 700 litres should be fine. In fact, I was looking at tanks of different sizes, and 700 litres was a standard kind of size. As you can see, well, this is a 700 litre tank, and they're designed, I think, for pushing around warehouses. You can put wheels on them, buy them with wheels on, and it's made from recycled plastic. And I took a punt on it, really. I just thought I think that would be okay, probably. So we decided to go with plastic tanks because we have a well nearby which isn't currently functioning, but we would like to get that up and running at some point, and we definitely don't want to be contaminating that with any pathogens. Sometimes people build cement and concrete chambers. That's another way of doing things. But essentially we decided that the plastic tanks was definitely a sealed method. Another way of doing this is just, with a tree bog, is just to poo straight on the soil, because the microorganisms in the soil are breaking down the human manure. And so the way we get around with that here is that we're taking compost with microbes in it and putting it into the tank. Now we finished using this in November, December last year, swapped them over. So this is sat for about 4 months. When I close the toilet down, I level it all out, because of course it will peak a bit at one end. Level it all out and put lots of leaf mould and sawdust and so on top. So you can see the material is all quite crumbly and pretty dry already. There's the occasional, well, that's just a bit of wood in there. So it's dried out very nicely. And yes, you've probably also noticed there's quite a lot of spiders, because the insects that break this down, and of course the breaking down doesn't happen without the microbes and the insects, because they all eat each other, attracts the spiders. And you might not be a fan of spiders, and this might not be great for you, but this is really important part of the system, because they're eating the flies to reduce the number of flies and so on and so forth. So this is good. So it's important to think about inputs and outputs, stocks and flows in regard to your compost toilet. So what things are coming in? Obviously urine and human manure. And where do they go? And what else might be coming into the shed? So for us, we like a bit of hygiene. So we have a water source and a sink for washing your hands. And the water comes from a rainwater tank, which is over on the other side of the orchard here and piped in from underneath. And the way this works is not by gravity, because the water tank's at about the same height, and gravity is a great thing if you're careful, but of course what can happen if someone leaves the tap on and it's just gravity fed, then the water disappears, and even a drip. And of course once you've got water collected in a tank, then that's quite a precious thing, because that same tank is being used for watering vegetables, plants and so on. So this water source is powered by a foot pump. It's just a standard foot pump that you would find in any caravan centre, designed for things like caravans, mobile homes. And that means that as soon as the person walks away, then there's no power to run the water anymore. So there's 2 taps, simply because this came from a scrapyard, a recycling centre, and I like to do that as much as possible when I'm making things. So this tap is completely irrelevant, and this is the only one that's plumbed in, but we use the foot pump to move the water. And of course it's also good to have a towel nearby in terms of zoning. So this water goes down the plug and then it goes out through the wall, and the reason it goes out through the wall is because the floor lifts up and there's no room for it inside. The pipe then goes back in this direction and then runs through underneath the urine separators. So when you use the urine separator, the urine runs away and out of the shed, and this water from the sink flushes it through. So that's part of that system. And where does it go from there? Well, it's really important that you work out where is it, if you're separating, where is all the urine going? Because if you just put it in bottles, you'll accumulate lots of it and it gets very ammonia rich quite quickly. So you need to use it straight away. Perhaps at festivals you've seen people using bales, straw bales. Barley straw is the best because it has microbes that help to break that down. For us, we've just got a pipe that runs down our windbreak hedge, and we alter, there's 2 different pipes and we just swap them from time to time, so that's going into different parts of the hedge, and the hedge is being fed, which means that it grows faster, which means we have a better windbreak. So we're utilising that waste product as a resource to actually do something that we want. Of course, if you're putting the wastewater from your sink into the hedge, directly into soil, then you need to be careful about what soap you're using. So this, well, looks like a manky old bar of soap, but this was specifically chosen as a soap that's fully biodegradable in a normal just sort of circumstance. I'm not saying this is the best soap to get, but there's one here that we found online which is properly biodegradable, because you want to make sure that whatever you're putting into the hedge is going to be feeding it and not poisoning it. So returning to the soak, which is this carbon-rich material. Ultimately, you can pretty much use anything that's going to have a lot of carbon in it and will do some soaking up. But the best material that I've come across, if you can get hold of it, is from a sawmill. So this is wood shavings before they've been treated by heat treated in a kiln or anything like that. So if you go to a woodwork shop, then you'll get often a lot of the shavings and sawdust will be kiln dried, and they won't have the same number of microbes in. This one's got an acorn in it, which is quite impressive. But yes, so this is from a woodland. The people that provide us with logs, they have a woodland. There's sort of a couple that the family own the woodland, and there's a big sort of planking machine there and under an open barn, and all of the shavings just go on the floor, and we're there once or twice a year and we just get to pick up all of the waste shavings and we bring that back, and that's perfect for us in the compost loo. This is going to have more microbes in it, which is good for helping to break down, but ultimately some form of carbon to use as a soak is what you need to go into the loo after you've used it. So there's a couple more things that we might want to be thinking about with our toilet. First one is smell, and if you're not mixing liquids and solids, you're probably not really going to have a smell problem, but it's something worth bearing in mind. The second thing is moisture, because as I said earlier, 90% of human manure is water, and that's got to go somewhere, and particularly in a system like ours where it's under the floor, you've got containers under the floor, they're waterproof containers. The moisture has to go somewhere, and we were finding that initially in the winter months that humidity coming off the human manure was condensing underneath the toilet seat. But one of the other key elements that you want to put into your system is a vent pipe, so that allows smells to escape but also to get the moisture out of the human manure, and that's why when I showed it to you just now it was so beautifully dry. And what this does, this is actually a whirlybird, which today isn't going round, but in the wind this spins, and that creates lower pressure up here compared to under the floor, and that draws the moist air and the smells out up the pipe rather than out from under the seat. And it works really well.